Climate to me was then and still is the biggest, most complex, most important challenge our species has ever faced, and that my career goal is maximum lifetime impact on climate. To do that, I think we need business and the forces of capitalism, which can move fast enough to meet this moment, to be harnessed to create the future that we all want and that we're all going to share.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, here with my co-host, Rene Velazquez. And today we're joined by Patrick Flynn, someone who has been at the forefront of corporate climate action for over a decade. Patrick is the founder of Switchboard, which connects the business world's most influential climate leaders to movements and moments that matter most. Patrick is also the former head of sustainability at Salesforce. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us.
What a joy. Excited to be here with you guys.
Yeah. I think to start, it would be awesome if you could just briefly take us through your career journey and what drove your efforts in climate and sustainability. And then it would also be great to hear about the work that you're doing present day.
Cool. I'll bring you through time then. So I studied mechanical engineering at Stanford undergrad, and my first job was in New York City doing mechanical engineering, building design, HVAC design for high-rise buildings, data centers, hospitals. And it was right when LEED certification and green buildings were taking off, so I had an environmental on-ramp, but I wouldn't at that point have identified as an environmentalist, really. Now, if I look back, even earlier, high school, middle school, elementary school, it's like every open-ended assignment that I was given, I did something environmental with it. So it was there, but I didn't really wear that badge. And what happened was I saw firsthand how poorly, in general, we design buildings and infrastructure. We think about maximum profit for the developer on day one and not long-term value creation. And just the miscommunication, misaligned incentives, I felt this responsibility to try to fix that problem and design more responsible buildings. The way I remember thinking about it back then is almost everybody doesn't need to know how their apartment building operates or how the internet works, but the engineers designing things have a huge responsibility to do it properly on their behalf and responsibly from the eyes of future stakeholders. So that was my entry point. From there, I went to an investment firm called Good Energies that was really active way back in the day. They were standing up a green buildings and energy efficiency investment arm. And so I stumbled upon this career advice I give to people all the time, which is half of your next job you should be able to do in your sleep, and half of it should terrify you. I didn't know anything about investing or venture capital, but I knew buildings and energy, mechanical engineering, energy efficiency. And so I got to be on this really steep learning curve, learning the investment side of things, but also delivering value as a subject matter expert. From there, back to business school, MIT, I studied sustainability and entrepreneurship, and I came out with a few things known. Climate to me was then and still is the biggest, most complex, most important challenge our species has ever faced, and that my career goal is maximum lifetime impact on climate. To do that, I think we need business and the forces of capitalism, which can move fast enough to meet this moment, to be harnessed to create the future that we all want and that we're all going to share. So I jumped into leading sustainability for a data center provider for a handful of years. Through that journey, I got to know the existing head of sustainability, Erin Decker, at Salesforce. I wanted her and Salesforce to pick the more sustainable data center option that we had. Voluntarily decided to move on and focus on clean energy. There was a job opening. I landed it, spent a good 7 years leading sustainability at Salesforce, and now for the past handful of years leading Switchboard, and like you say, trying to connect the business world's most influential climate leaders to the movements and moments that matter most, which so often lack just a small number of companies to step up and support them.
Awesome. And I want to talk about Switchboard towards the end of this episode, but I think to begin with the first section, would love to talk about the chief sustainability officer role, because it's evolved dramatically over the past decade. So I would love to explore what the role actually entails and what challenges that maybe aren't visible from the outside actually exist on the inside. So let's start with the role itself. Like, what does a chief sustainability officer actually do day to day, and what might the job entail that people outside don't really see?
Great. I think we'll touch on the evolution of it. We'll get into my interpretation of it. So for me, in a way, it's to be the planet's advocate inside of the company. I think of myself as somebody who works for planet Earth and also from time to time works for a company, and I'm trying to meet the demands or thread the needle of those two very demanding bosses, if you will. And I think that mentality is shared by those who got into sustainability long ago, before there even was a chief sustainability officer, back when you might have had to do it off the side of your desk, even when nobody was asking you to do it, because of a sense of responsibility. And so part of the role, for those who see it that way, like me, is like this extreme tension between what the planet needs and what the scientists are telling us we need to deliver, and what business needs and what business is able to deliver. And it can feel like those things are getting farther apart. Sometimes you can pull them back together. The metaphor I use there is that the role of a head of sustainability is like that of a rubber band puller trying to close that gap. And if you pull too hard, if you get religious about it and aren't in touch with business needs, the rubber band snaps and you're not going to be effective. So at all times, it's tension management, pulling as hard as you can, not too hard, in order to close the gap.
So what I'm hearing is almost influencing without direct authority, right? Like, I mean, how do you navigate that?
That's a big part of the job. And if I kind of take stock of what I've learned, whatever 10,000 hours of expertise I've amassed at this point, it's influence and being able to drive change. And a few things come to mind there. No matter what you're trying to change, at some point you need to change a person. So there are human sociological strategies that come to play there, and also a lot of logic as well, black and white logic. So creating change through influence. I say things like, before you ever ask a colleague for something, you need to know their dog's name, which could be a dog, could be the college they went to, could be the sport that they watch every Saturday. But you need to know them, respect them, understand what makes them tick, and really genuinely have an appreciation and a business empathy for what they're going through.
But that's just kind of building coalitions, right? Like, you do that naturally within, like you said, building empathy within a workforce and a company helps to build those bonds, and ultimately enables you to have those hard conversations, because you have the underlying trust where they know that it's not antagonistic. It's just to say, you have a relationship already, but then you can have these harder conversations around that inherent tension, like you said. Hey, if we continue to pull in this one direction, we're going to get further and further away from this side. How can you help me meet sort of halfway, reduce some of that tension, right?
That's right. And in that light, it's a very universal business skill to understand the team around you and what their motivations are. One thing that's unique about the sustainability role is how many different teams and different business languages you need to be able to pivot and code switch into. Legal and procurement and marketing and finance and engineering and on and on and on. So the code switching, the language switching is a critical piece of all of that as well.
Yeah. And is there often this kind of pressure, I mean, at least from some of the sustainability teams that we've worked with, it's quite difficult for them to show tangible ROI on climate investments, right? It's almost sort of looked at as just an upfront cost that's going to cost the business, X amount of dollars over this period of time. And it's kind of it relates to what you're saying about the rubber band, because you're trying to influence and trying to make that business case. So how do you frame like climate action in terms executives or boards or, you know, head of treasury and finance understand, right?
Mm.
Like, I think I want to touch on that aspect of like making the business case for the planet, right? Like you said.
Right. And it varies and it has evolved too. I think if we rewind the clock, a lot of environmental strategy, environmental tactics, and progress were in building efficiency, clean energy, supply chain. And that was the nature of the environmental head of a company for, 20 years ago for a good while. And interestingly, that role leading sustainability at the data center, when I look back on it, it was a wonderful training ground for me for my change management skills because the financial optimization of the company and the environmental optimization were very highly correlated. So I got to speak the business case, speak like a finance person. Higher utilization, energy efficiency, clean energy, storage, all of those things were in the money strategies that also had great environmental wins. So there's a safe place there for anybody out there creating change in their organization for the environment in all of those things. They're in the money. What gets interesting is when you start to have to bring in other harder to model, harder to put into a spreadsheet value, attracting and retaining top talent, supply chain resilience, risk. The big one is brand. Most public companies have 60-70% of their market cap in intangible value. And a hit to the brand, positive or negative, is a giant lever. But you can't put that into a spreadsheet and forecast exactly how it's going to play out. You kind of need to rely on stakeholders want us to do this. It builds goodwill. Our customers want us to do this. Our employees want us to do this. It doesn't cost that much to give us a very good chance of very high financial returns by being a good corporate citizen, by being on the right side of history. And I guess I'll swing back to that customer wants this element. That to me is the most motivating thing we need to harness to get capitalism heading in the right direction. The demand signal from customer to supplier. If you do it more responsibly, on the margin, we'll do more business with you than the one who's not doing it responsibly. If you meet these goals of ours, we will be a happier customer. We'll do more business with you. That signal is there. It's just not strong enough. And that's a lot of how I think about Switchboard's role in this, is making sure that demand signal gets felt from customer to supplier, or customer up to supplier.
Patrick, I completely agree with that. And I've actually seen that firsthand, but I've also seen the reverse of it in aviation, for example, with Delta. But actually, just a quick question on that kind of trajectory. How does that interrelate with the social license to operate, essentially?
Yeah, I think that's a big piece of it. And it's another squishier one, fuzzier one to try to model. But social license to operate, the ability to be in good standing with stakeholders, policymakers, regulators, employees, all of that are pathways to very strong business value.
Yeah, because otherwise the alternative is you end up putting the wrong foot down, and then basically your business, like you said, your brand is eroded.
Yeah,
significantly.
that's right. Yeah, and all of this, I don't mean to be coming across as tone deaf or naive to the political environment we find ourselves in here in the United States. It's different now than it was during the stretch when I was back at Salesforce, certainly, and it's challenging. You mentioned Delta. We've seen companies get hit for being pro-climate. I think the rational thing to do is to rest on what good business logic it makes to be working for a better future.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's something that we definitely see with regards to the voluntary carbon market. Keyword voluntary. A lot of these companies voluntarily putting up capital into these amazing projects that help the climate and help people, kind of being very criticized for doing so, whereas other companies that do nothing aren't criticized.
Hide in the margins.
It's this paradox we find ourselves in the
Yeah.
carbon markets. But you touched on supply chain and the relationship with suppliers. So I wanted to talk about in the next section market-based mechanisms for value chain decarbonization, kind of scope three in value chain decarbonization as a whole. Because for most companies, scope three emissions dwarf their scope one and two. So, from your perspective, what's the state of corporate scope three strategies today? Like, are companies making real progress on value chain decarbonization, or is it mostly like long-term kicking it down the can kind of aspiration?
The short answer up front is I'm very excited by the momentum in scope 3 right now. So I'll go into it in more detail. You're right. Most companies' emissions are in their scope 3. For most companies, it's upstream scope 3, up in their supply chain. And for most of those suppliers, most of their emissions is upstream in their supply chain. So one of the challenges here is you need to push your suppliers, but also you need to recognize that at the end of the day, a lot of your upstream scope 3 emissions are from a million different paper cuts in tier N supply chain decision, tier N reality. So the way I think about the strategy is absolutely you need to push your direct suppliers. One of the things I'm really proud of during the Salesforce time was we made climate a part of all standard purchase agreements in Salesforce. And to this day, I have people say that they have their job in sustainability at their company because we sent that to them and the company had to scramble and find a head of sustainability to meet the demands. They had to set science-based targets, have emission reduction strategies, and deliver all products and services on a carbon neutral basis or pay for us to go get the carbon credits to neutralize the emissions of those products and services. So yeah, you do need to do that, I think. And it's open source. Anybody can take that contract appendix and use it. Many companies have. And also you need to go to the root cause of those emissions. So I mentioned the million paper cuts. One really nice thing is even if your emissions are scattered across tier N suppliers, fundamentally, on average, they are about clean electricity, electrified transportation, land use change, industrial heat, agriculture. It's the same dozen ingredients that get us 99% of the way to our climate progress. So figure out which one of those is material to you or strategic to you and go help solve clean energy or electrified transportation somewhere, maybe really relevant to your supply chain or your supply shed, or maybe where your influence can unlock the most amount of forward progress. And that's where we start to get to market-based mechanisms. It's just an efficient way that we operate all around us all the time. I have a willingness to pay for value, in this case, decarbonization. Why would I need to do it internally in my own operations only when there might be a far more attractive, far more catalytic place with more co-benefits to do it in the hands of my supplier's supplier? And when we start doing that, we have instruments in order to demonstrate the effectiveness of the intervention and the money paid. And that's how efficient markets work for everything.
Yeah.
I love that. And it's about aligning incentives, ultimately. Like you said, it's about creating those incentives, not perverse, but actually optimal incentives to actually change that behavior set. And like most business leaders are very rational in their thinking, right? And like you said, if the suppliers, so if your client's client is asking for something, you're the supplier's supplier, effectively you're going to move and you're going to make those changes that are requisite in order to meet with more orders, essentially, for your business sustainability long term.
Right. Absolutely. And I think kind of tying this back to business case, it's worth mentioning one way I think about this, the planet is going to get hotter and hotter, and climate change is going to cause more and more damage and destruction. That's physics. Now, eventually, we will all find different moments when we see that urgency firsthand and wake up and try to mobilize in order to rise to this great challenge that we all share. I think the greatest determinant over the long term of a strategic decision is how well it lines up to a world that responds to climate change. It could be the degree that you choose to study in college. It could be the place you decide to put down roots and raise a family. It could be your career choices. But one of the biggest explanatory variables here is going to be how well it lines up with a world of climate action.
I like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with regards shifting over to kind of corporate policy, advocacy, and influence beyond value chain, right? Like corporate climate action isn't just limited to operational emissions reductions and market-based mechanisms like carbon credits or renewable energies credits, SAF. I mean, what does good corporate climate policy advocacy look like, right? Like what should companies be advocating for? And how can sustainability teams kind of influence their company's policy positions? Because that's a big aspect of it as right. Like trade associations tend to be a major challenge for global companies, right? And oftentimes they find themselves mixed up in the kind of the heat of politics, like the current situation that we find ourselves in today, right? With lobbyists and other groups kind of butting heads. So there's that kind of rubber band analogy that you used internally at a company. But then there's like the more macro kind of the bigger rubber band at the global level, right? With really large companies with massive footprints, right? I guess.
I think, let me swing through that question.
That was a long question.
In general, influence is a underutilized currency among companies. Whether we're talking about adding climate sustainability to your conversation with your suppliers or with policymakers, it doesn't cost that much in the scheme of things to layer on something related to your values and what you stand for in the future that you and your company aspire to see happen. For those in the role in corporates looking to build up that policy advocacy capacity, number one, it starts with meet the government affairs team or whatever the name of it is that handles these sorts of topics. I've found they are wired very similarly to a sustainability professional. And so that code switching is not really that hard. There's a lot of different jargon and government works in ways that maybe we're less familiar with, and there's a learning curve there. But thinking about the future, probabilistically influencing in order to change future outcomes, weighing apples, oranges, and bananas in priority decisions, that's kind of what people focused on policy and influence do all the time. So you can meet them there. Next piece of advice would be to try to write down what the company stands for. What are the principles that you believe in for anything? Workforce development, equality, justice, nature, climate. And I would highly recommend doing that when there is not a policy moment that needs you to weigh in next Friday or it has passed. Do it in the off season when times are a little slower and write it down. And if possible, put it in the public domain. That was a big part of what allowed Salesforce to be a very good policy advocacy leader, is we had language in the public domain. They still do climate policy principles, AI policy principles, etc. And so when a moment came around to use influence over a policy decision, we could look at that we had spent good time on, those artifacts, and mine them for language in order to have our positions stated. We weren't manufacturing new sentences and new language left and right. And then you touched on trade associations. It's a tricky one because a lot of them are lobbying against climate action on behalf of some of their influential members, and a lot of their members don't agree with that position. What I've heard over the years is it's a tough calculus because a company may be really aligned with the Chamber of Commerce, let's say, on immigration and tariffs and cybersecurity and taxation. And there's a lot of benefit from being part of it in those dimensions, even if one like climate is at odds with what the company's values are. So you kind of have two choices at that point. You try to depart and make your stance felt and find another way to get the benefits in those other dimensions that we talked about and align with your climate goals, or you lean in and try to change the position of the trade association from within.
Patrick, I like that. It's really interesting. And I like that whole analogy of like the off-season piece. But it requires leadership to demonstrate and to have that confidence to communicate your values, especially in times when you're facing a lot of headwinds politically, right? Because oftentimes the easier route is to just not cause something that is going to just bring friction. Again, you talked about the dictum of protecting your brand, because so much of the intrinsic value of the company is related to brand. But oftentimes true leadership has to go and stand up in those moments. How do you see the current administration right now? Let's not talk sort of politically, but like obviously talking about climate has gone out of fashion to a large extent, right? We just saw Davos, where it was on the agenda 2, 3, 4 years ago as at the top of the stack, and climate is now devoid from those conversations in most parts, right? Yet in the background, it seems a lot of the major mega cap companies continue on their quest to decarbonize, even though they're seeing huge growth in the form of data centers and AI, but they're more quiet about it. Ultimately, how does that leadership transform? How does it demonstrate itself? Is it quiet leadership? Is it open, vociferous? Like, how does it manifest? It's a hard one because it's not one size fits all. But
yeah. I mean, one way I think about it is in terms of the cyclicality of seasons. And right now, to be in corporate climate action in the United States, you're facing a layering of bad seasonal conditions right now. Economic uncertainty, macroeconomic environmental challenges, geopolitical uncertainty, the politicization of climate. It's a rough season to bring forward the bold ambition and the adherence to what the scientists all know for sure is happening. And seasons change, right? Here in San Francisco, we can have very foggy days. We can have very sunny days. It's hard to picture. It's hard to remember what it feels like to be soaking in the sun, getting a suntan when it's cold and foggy out there, but it changes. Now, I think I've been coming back to this Amory Lovins quote over the past year or so. Long ago, he said, people don't care about energy, they care about cold beer and hot showers. And I think there's a parallel with climate. We've talked about climate action. I say climate action. It's not for climate itself. It's not because I actually care that much that I'm breathing more CO2 right now. It's for those who have done the least, who are suffering the most from climate change. It's for lower utility bills and economic resilience. It's for all of these tangible things. So part of what you're seeing is the word climate going a bit out of favor and leaders heading back to the specific things that show up that climate action benefits and making it a little bit more tangible to people. And yes, you're right. There's also a green hushing, keep on getting the great work done, talk about it less. I certainly hope that changes. I think we need leaders to demonstrate vocal, bold leadership. And most likely that's going to come in the form of groups of companies standing up as opposed to one thinking about going it alone. It's just riskier that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. It kind of reminds me of that story of King Solomon and the ring, right? Like this too shall pass, essentially, right? Which humbles, in times of, excess, etc. It'll humble the proud and then ultimately comfort the suffering in that context. But yeah, in trading, the analogy is always keeping a level head, right? Separating emotions, because again, everything's cyclical. Things go up and things go down. Never get too high, never get too low. And if you just stay consistent, you just continue to do the work, the results actually start to accumulate. It's like the compounding effect.
That's right. And that would be a very comfortable place for all of us to be in, but for carbon budgets and the fact that we can't withstand an infinite number of cycles of inaction to action. We need big, fast change now. And that's where I think, in my mind, that the logical thing to do is to make sure the tactics you're taking deliver the potential for speed and scale that meet the moment. And we talked about the evolution of the CSO. 20 years ago, we could meet a 1.5 degree future with every company making 3% emissions reductions, 5% emission reductions, a nice steady glide path. A decade ago, that didn't look like that was going to happen. Most companies were absent or moving backwards. So it really felt like during my stretch at Salesforce, we need those leading companies with the largest purchasing power, the greatest influence, the most influential customers to outpace and to demonstrate catalytic results. And fast forward to today, it's that even more so. And it's why I believe we need the kinds of things that I'm working on at Switchboard to bring trust and community and collective action from multiple companies to address changes to entire industries, parts of their supply chain, entire governments. The unlock we need right now in order to reach the speed and scale requirements are groups of companies coming together more often to create big change.
Yeah. Yeah. So, naturally transitioning to Switchboard, we want to learn about that and the work that you're doing there. Switchboard, Topo Finance. Let's start with Switchboard.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned it briefly, but what is it? Why did you start it? After.
Yeah. Well, I use the word superpowers a lot in thinking about climate action. And the message is that, if you're listening to this and you're interested in stepping into or aligning your career to climate action, you don't need to go back to school. Take whatever brilliant skills you already have and apply them. So artists making art for climate action, lawyers filing amicus briefs for climate action, etc. At the individual level, we need all hands on deck, and the most efficient thing is for you to play your part doing what you do best. Now, the same is true at the company level as well. What does your company do? What's its superpower? Its products and services, or maybe a geography or an industry that it has outsized influence over. Lean in there and use your company's superpower in order to create big change. So I'll use that as a through line to talk about how Switchboard came to be. Going back to Salesforce days, Salesforce's superpower is software in the hands of all of Salesforce's customers, and in particular, software that helps those customers understand their own customers much better. So you have this supplier-customer phenomenon happening in the Salesforce superpower. So one of the big quests internally through indirect influence was to build and stand up and get Net Zero Cloud greenlit, which is a tool for Salesforce customers to understand their emissions and develop strategies for climate. As a byproduct of that, I got to meet the heads of sustainability across tons of different companies and understand what their needs were and how they were thinking about climate. And entering into this most recent chapter of Switchboard, I had that going for me as a superpower. I have great trusted relationships with heads of sustainability at lots of companies, and I know what they're going through. I've been in their shoes. I can help them with advice and strategy. So as I was thinking about what my next professional adventure was going to be, I was thinking about, well, what can I uniquely do? And I can strengthen and build those relationships, but to what end? And so Switchboard, the way I've kind of thought about it is this Venn diagram for me and how I'm trying to spend my time. One circle is the issues that matter most to the planet, the things that can get big and fast, and doing for those topics that which I can uniquely do. So connecting the business world's most influential climate leaders to the movements and moments that matter most. Kind of like a universal toolkit for creating collective action. And you mentioned Topo Finance. That's one of the groups I love supporting. And this one's kind of in the scope 3 conversation and influence conversation we were having earlier. And it has to do with companies using their influence in the engagement they have with their banks. And it's an interesting blind spot for many corporate sustainability teams. Number one, banking is not a procurement relationship. So they're not thought of really like a supplier. It's not the same kind of arm's length transaction. It's a treasury relationship. For most companies, for any non-financial institutions, the emissions associated with their cash and deposits in the hands of their banks are not required by the greenhouse gas protocol. But when you do that emissions calculation, the numbers are staggering. Every $1 billion in the hands of a major Wall Street bank is about 300,000 tons of CO2 emissions per year. And that's because 20 to 30% of that money is getting invested in fossil fuel projects. There's an emissions factor associated with investment activity. And when you apply that to a company's balance sheet, the emissions are quite high. And
Patrick,
that's
term I'm remembering from
finance emission. That's exactly right. And by the way, it's the same for you and I. The same emissions factor metric. Every $10,000 I may have in a Wall Street bank is 3 tons of emissions per year. And so you start to like ladder that up to whatever checking account size you're thinking about. And talking to your bank, or maybe switching your bank, or the products you use with the same bank, might be the biggest climate action step you can do this year, bigger than switching to an EV or plant-based diet or electrified home, flying less. Like it's a big lever for change, and we know how to do it. We know how to engage collaboratively with parts of our supply chain and use our values and ask for better products and better behavior. Like that's something sustainability practitioners know how to do. And so with Topo, we're developing the tools and the team, and we've got over a few dozen companies deeply engaged in engaging their banks and working with their treasurers to get new products and better behavior out of the banks.
That's super interesting. I mean, it's almost like unspoken. I guess it's so important, but at the same time, there's a lack of awareness.
Yeah.
But do you think, is it a lack of awareness, or is it a lack of like a methodology or like something else? Like, do people actually know, individuals and organizations, how can they actually figure out what they can do? Like what you mentioned, engaging existing banks, maybe using green financial products, et cetera, et cetera. Like it seems to be something that's kind of low key, not really on everyone's top priority, but at the same time, it's, on the top of the list with regards to pollution and emissions.
Right. Yeah. It's one of the biggest levers that anybody inside a company may be able to pull upon. And by the way, changing the investment activity of your own money in order to support clean energy and electric vehicles and land use change and all of those sources of emissions we were talking about earlier deep in your supply chain is going to flow through to help you meet your Scope 3 goals. Awareness needs to grow. If you asked me a few years ago, it was an awareness thing. We're right on the cusp of, there's enough awareness. We've got enough amazing companies who see it and have great relationships with their treasurer. Now it's about pathways and making sure companies can get the products that they need, find the teams inside the banks who have been waiting for this demand signal to arrive at their doorstep, and replicating that for others to make the process easier.
On that, it's interesting, and I've been taking mental notes of everything you've been saying, Patrick. I want to kind of do a journey back to something you said earlier, which was talking about speed and scale, which is obviously referencing John Doerr's famous book, right? And talking about how those two provide leverage effectively, right? That speed without scale is effectively noise, and scale without the speed is effectively denial. And then kind of bringing it to the point of, and so I'd like to get you to talk about that and how influential that kind of thesis has been in your work and your next evolution. But then picking up from the bit around what you just said, which is essentially, and this one's really resonating with me around how the biggest climate lever that many companies have isn't their operations, it's where their money goes, right? And so ultimately that's where scale comes from, right? It's their balance sheets, their procurement power, their financial flows, their policy influence, and it's rather than the operational tweaks alone, right?
Yeah.
Can I just get your thoughts on that and the kind of journey and the influence around speed and scale and that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to go to Doerr's book, a great book folks should read. before it was that concise and in that language, I was telling my old team, the least rational thing we can do is to spend our time on strategies that don't have a chance to get big enough fast enough to matter, right? Like we could all steadily have operational emission improvements from here till the end of time and think we're doing fine and walk off this climate cliff. We need to protect as much innovation, bandwidth, budget, political influence, and deploy that towards strategies that can get big enough, fast enough for the planet to actually notice. Financed emissions is definitely one of those to me. We know the process of engaging suppliers. And on top of banks, you've also got 401ks, 401k providers. I moved my own retirement plan over to Carbon Collective's strategy to align with climate action. And for financial reasons, you know me, I take great pride in doing it because it's the right thing to do. But back to what I said about climate action being one of the greatest determinants of which strategy succeeds and fails over the long term, over the decades between now and when I retire, I absolutely believe I will be in a better position by excluding fossil and overinvesting, overweighting in the technology companies and others that are driving a clean energy future. And then you've also got insurance. Premiums for the Planet is a group I love to support. And the insurance industry has a huge role to play in the future that we create, from their underwriting decisions to also their own investment activity behind the banks. They're the second largest money manager in the world. Investing your premiums and influencing them is critical as well. So these are big levers. In some way, I mean, this has showed up to me a few times over the many years, but I kind of get excited when something is obviously not happening enough. Like, part of you wishes this was a full-fledged, mature part of a company's strategy across the board already. But it's great to find a lever that is giant that you know how to pull that nobody's bothered to pull yet, right? So I get really excited thinking about the inevitability of adding banking, Ks and insurance as part of your climate portfolio, because all we need to do is just accelerate this inevitable transition that we're going to have.
100%. And I think you articulated that extremely well. And I think this has been an incredibly valuable conversation. You've given us a look inside the CSO role that we rarely get. I mean, you talked about your work at Switchboard and Topo Finance, kind of pushing the corporate climate community to think bigger, move faster. So we really appreciate you joining us today on this episode. And we thank our audience for tuning in.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Patrick, before we let you go, can I just ask you on something that you said, which I thought was really prescient, which was that intersection. You called it the Venn diagram. Yeah. And it got me thinking about a book that I read a little while ago called Ikigai, which is the Japanese concept of, for meaning, effectively, like a reason for being. And it's like, I had to look it up exactly to get the perfect diagram. So I've got it in the background, and we probably put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
But it's like what you love,
what the world needs, what you're good at, what you enjoy, and what you get paid for.
And what you get paid for. And it's just like this perfect intersection. If you can find it, like you just find so much joy and meaning in life. Yes. And oftentimes people are skewed to one side, and they either pursue their passion, but then lack the financial sort of vocation piece. Other times they just do the work and it's meaningless to a lot of extent, but they get paid for it, etc. But it's finding that intersection where it aligns with the mission.
Yes,
that's really key. So it's great that you're advocating that, and I think it's a call to hopefully inspire folks in the audience to try to find that perfect marriage of what they're really good at, what the world needs, what they love, and what they can get paid for.
Yes, absolutely. You could do this on any AI platform now as well. Like if you want an Ikigai coach, that'd be a good prompt. Like, I want you to interview me about how I find Ikigai. Ask me questions about what I'm good at, what I enjoy, and have yourself a little coaching session to get into the centered place. Well, thank you. I can't believe we're already done. I feel like we just scratched the surface. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for doing these episodes, and thanks for having me on.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.